tonight we actually have the privilege to invite Mr. Neil Sinclair to be with us here and give us a guest lecture. So Neil right now is the chairman of Commerce Network, a media platform for in-depth analysis and expert reporting on the future of financial services, healthcare, and the media industries. Previously, Neil worked at Vastly, a venture-backed and data-enabled content marketing platform for financial services marketing, right? So there you actually applied AI to engage customers with personalized content at scale, right? So tonight, Neil will be talking about how to apply data-driven decision-making for enterprises. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Neil Sinclair. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it. So most important thing first, I have social media. Who's going to record me? This is my good side. So there's got someone over here who wants that. All right, here. Just get to hit record. It's easy. Well, thank you so much for having me, guys. Really appreciate it. The professor promoted me a little bit. I'm the president of the Commerce Network, not the chairman, but hopefully get there someday. So I'm going to start off with just a very quick story about why NYU is special to me. You may notice even in the winter, I don't wear socks. And it was actually here at NYU when I was a young startup guy pitching at an NYU pitch day that I decided I wasn't going to wear socks for the rest of my life. And that's going on a decade now. So it holds a special place in my heart. The reason I tell you that story, because we'll have a couple of interactive moments in this presentation, is that you may not remember a single thing I say tonight. But you remember that kind of weird guy that stood up here and didn't wear socks, right? So if there comes a moment where I call on you, I don't need your full biography. I want you to come up with one weird fact that's going to allow me to remember you, because I'm really bad with names. All right? So really excited to be here today because this is a space that I've lived in for quite some time. We're going to talk specifically about data-driven decision-making as related to how enterprises use it in the real world, right? Because I'm sure you're getting a lot of the academic knowledge and the reason why this exists, but we really have to fundamentally talk about how businesses like mine, almost every business I've had over the last decade, has integrated data to make smarter and better decisions. So let's start with a couple of points. And I may be a little redundant here, Professor. Maybe you'll disagree. We'll see. So data can tell us everything. 90% of all people know that, right? That's a little bad joke. But what we're going to focus on in this conversation is really the idea of synthesis, interpretation, and most importantly, actionability, right? We are at a phase in the world right now where data can be collected, but I do not believe that is actionable at scale. We'll talk a little bit about why that is. We're going to really focus on why data only works in what I believe is a beautiful blend of humans, which are our art, as well as the science, which are our machines. I was saying to a professor earlier, I'm giving a lecture at the AI Tech Day in May. You're all invited. It's very exciting, promise. But I'm the guy that doesn't believe AI actually exists. I don't believe that it will exist for 50 years. I think it's actually a branding term, right? We have machine learning, and that's not highly adaptable or actionable, so we'll talk about that a bit. Data must also be contextualized, and more importantly, it must be benchmarked. I have talked to innumerable companies who are like, here's our metrics. I'm like, cool. How is that against your comps and peers? And guess what? They have no idea. They're like, our open rate on our email was 10%. Great. How is that against your industry average? How is it against your better competitors? So contextualization and understanding within your cohort, but also making sure it's benchmarked is highly important. And here's the last point. How many people in here have, say, I'll use my sock example, looked at a pair of red socks and then immediately were serviced with an ad for a red sweatshirt or something like that, even though it's completely irrelevant to your actual shopping habits, right? That's Amazon, that's marketing retargeting, that's many of these things getting the algorithm wrong. The big guys are still figuring it out. So don't take what they're serving you as truth. You can see it in your own lives every single day, how data is still not misused, but misinterpreted and misunderstood. So let's talk about the three truths of data-driven decision making. Firstly, there's something that I believe is called a cross-vertical universality of data. I'm not going to give you a presentation that's specific to my businesses, that we're going to get into some fun case studies in a little bit. There are universal truths underneath data because it's driven by human beings. And since time immemorial, the psychology, the things that give us joy, the things that cause us fear, the things that cause us to make decisions in choice theory, that hasn't changed. So it doesn't matter what business you're in, you may collect different data, but the reasons for that data and the methodology and the framework of thinking about how to collect data and how it's applicable to your business, that's highly universal. It also, whenever you're collecting data, as you're setting up a framework for your company or whatever it might be, must tell a behavioral, human-centered story. I see a lot of data and a lot of data points that don't tell a story and don't make a lot of sense, certainly not on their own. So what we're going to talk about is how you can tell a meaningful story through data by reverse engineering that and working back from an actual question a real human being would ask you. I love data scientists, I work with them closely. They're a different kind of human being, right? So let's talk about how someone like me, who's on the management side of things, may utilize data and may want from you as a data scientist the things that you're working on. We also must be able to test and validate or obliterate assumptions with our data. If you're not doing that with your data, then it's not serving any particular purpose. And those are the things that you have to start with. And we'll talk a little bit later on about what you do when all you have are assumptions and no evidence, and you're living in a completely ambiguous data framework. And guess what? You start a company, 99% chance that's what you're going to do. So let's talk about the three uses of data. Firstly, I believe data, as you're thinking about why am I going to take the time to set up a data framework, why am I going to make an investment in this, it must be utilized to improve process and efficiency. That has to be point number one. If you're adding more work by creating a data framework and taking 80% more time to do data that's not saving you any time, then you shouldn't be doing it at all. It also must provide insight to the business or client. That's a pretty basic fundamental truth. However, I can't tell you how many businesses I advise that just collect data for the sake of collecting data. And they genuinely have no idea why they have the data that they have, how they're going to utilize it. All I often get on like the last page of a presentation is, one of our revenue streams, we're gonna sell our data. I'm like, you have no idea what your data is, how it's utile, how it's useful to somebody like me, right? That's not a business plan. So it has to, at the end of the day, provide an insight. And it has to, I believe, be something that can be productized, but you have to start with that from the beginning, or it has to be something that's directly applicable to your revenue. If you're not doing one of these three things, sometimes it's okay to not collect data right away until you've figured it out. So let's talk a little bit about a roadmap and signpost the rest of this presentation here, right? Because that was just kind of the prelude. So firstly, this is a little bit about me, right? We're going to talk about a guy that wears a suit, no socks, loves big data, this character right here. We're also going to go through three very, very, very quick non-Harvard style case studies of actual businesses that I've run and operated and how we've utilized data, or importantly, how we failed to utilize data. I'm going to talk to you about the boring but really necessary stuff, which is at least how I in the real world set up a data model. There's a lot that goes into it. We're also then going to talk about how we use data, but also why big data doesn't always work. We have a lot of noise and not a lot of signal in our current state. Let's also talk about when data doesn't exist. I alluded to this earlier, right? I call this the just do it principle, right? Like there's so many people that get into this very sclerotic analysis paralysis style situation when they're like, oh, I don't have the data, and they just kind of think about things until the data reveals itself. That's not the way the real world works. And then I'm going to give you three predictions that I assure you will be 90% wrong, but you'll know how to find me, so you'll be able to call me out on it. So very quickly about me, so you know the character standing in front of you and why I might actually know what I'm talking about, or why I'm just some confused individual. So firstly, started life as a television journalist for New York One. Don't try to find those old stories. My hair wasn't as good back then. I have built 4 businesses over the last decade. 2 of those were successful, and I was able to have exits from those. 2 of those were not. I won't make you guess which ones, but I can tell you that the person-to-person marketplace on buy that did not work out. I was the CMO for the 3rd largest independent investment advisory firm called Shepherd Kaplan. They're still around. Grew them from $7.5 billion to an $11.5 billion company. I was 27 years old at the time, and I assure you I knew nothing when I stepped in the door. Why they hired me is still a delightful mystery to me. I was also, as your professor mentioned, the chief growth officer for an artificial intelligence company called Investorly. We were a SaaS platform. We utilized data to provide virtuous cycles of story loops and content for financial services companies. Secret, don't tell the guys at Investorly because they're still around. It wasn't really AI, it was machine learning. But again, branding phrases and all that. Currently serve as the president of Timeless, which is our parent company, as well as the Karma Network, which is a membership organization and media platform for ultra-high net worth individuals, mostly under 40, looking to do private marketplace social impact investments. Check it out in your leisure, not what I'm talking. Done a bunch of other weird, cool stuff. I was telling a professor I'm currently writing a book about the science of failure. So if you've ever failed at anything in your life, come chat with me afterwards, and maybe there's a case study or something in there. I also want to note when we get to the Q&A period, don't try to trick me up. I don't have any opinions on Hadoop or NoSQL. I am not the tech guy here. on the business side. So that portion is taken care of for me by people that wear really nice thick glasses. So let's do a little bit of case studying here. One of the companies that I ran was an insurance technology play called Rice. Here's a very quick background and just a couple of ideas on how to start a company. Go ask somebody really high up at a company what their biggest small problem is right now. I assure you, unless you're an expert like I was not in the insurance industry, that you can't solve their biggest problem, which is how do I get less clients and more money, right? Yeah. So we started the Thrice technology business by simply asking a pre-marketing question, which is, hey Spencer, who was the number 2 guy at one of the largest insurance firms, what's your biggest small problem? I'll never understand your business well enough to solve your problems completely. And what he told me was we had this hugely efficient amount of data coming in that first of all was a manual process. I'm paying an analyst $200,000 a year to call up FEMA and ask if the floodplain zone has changed for parcel XYZ. Well, we coded out a solution for that in relatively short order. How did they use data? Because now we were taking all these manual data processes and we're able to actually put it together into a really nice, pretty package for them. They were able to synthesize that data, make risk adjustment and analysis, do all sorts of cool things that they were never able to do before. Data work in this particular case because there are a lot of companies out there that I call the NCM regime, right? These are folks living in yesteryear that have a CIO that basically sets up their printers. They have no idea how to use data or technology effectively. This presents a huge market opportunity. What we did specifically for them was create that synthesis of data. What we weren't able to do, and we weren't contracted to do, was to create that predictive modality of data, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So all we did was take a bunch of stuff that was living on manual interpretation across a bunch of spreadsheets in Excel. There wasn't even a cloud-based solution for this, and we were able to put that into one single place to increase their efficiency and ultimately to help them with some of their margin-based problems. So going back to the reasons of why you want to have data, that was the particular use case here. Let's talk about Vesperly for a moment. As I mentioned, venture-backed AI SaaS platform. Data here for us was both an ally and an enemy. So as an ally, it allowed us to have a business, right? So we were able to go out and basically start a machine learning virtuous cycle that pulled in a bunch of content. People would then click on that content, would get fed back into the algorithm. We'd say, this person likes this kind of content, let's serve them with more of that content. That data was extremely helpful for building the base of the business. Here's the great secret. Again, don't tell them because they're still around. We got it wrong more often than we got it right. So now, just because you clicked on something, we started making too many bold assumptions based on the data because an algorithm can't interpret like a human being, right? You can't do a lot of the certain layers of sentiment analysis that tells you that this article about something called the fiduciary rule, which I wouldn't expect you to know about, but is very controversial within the financial services world, is actually a negative article. And what we're doing now is servicing up content from your registered investment advisor that is saying negative things about the fiduciary rule, and all your investment advisor is doing in the real world is telling you how great the fiduciary rule is. What do you think that does to the relationship, right? It makes you look like you're contradictory, and it ultimately erodes trust. So data can, I believe, be both an ally and an enemy, and that's why I still very much believe in a human curatorial measure in everything that you do. Last thing. This is my company that failed miserably. It was my first startup. May you have many failed first startups. It's the best way to actually learn. So the company was called UnBuyThat. It was a peer-to-peer marketplace focused on buying and reselling hotel rooms. You ever know a company called Rumor? They do essentially exactly the same thing. They just did it a lot better than we did, and they were backed and owned by the billionaire founder of Waze. I'm not a billionaire, sorry. What we did with UnBuyThat was we were really, at the end of the day, punished by the data gods. Why? Because we didn't take data seriously. Right? We thought that we knew better, that we could apply our own logic. We did no pre-marketing. We had no idea what the marketplace was actually requesting. We really didn't tick entire algorithm because we had a programmatic algorithm that actually acquired hotel rooms to take the demand side out of the equation. And we got everything from a data perspective wrong because we didn't take it seriously enough. Started this company back in 2011, somewhere around there. This is before big data was really a big part of the conversation. This is before everybody was a data scientist. We just didn't apply that methodology, and it's a big reason why that business ultimately failed. So just giving you a little bit of background on how data has practically been integrated into every one of my businesses. In this case, it was not, and that was one of the biggest predictors as to why we ultimately didn't succeed. So let's talk very briefly about some of the boring stuff, which is setting up a data model. I'm sure in this class you talked quite a bit about this. This is how we do it in the real world. It's hard work. It's not inexpensive. It's painful, but you've got to do it right, or else everything that I'm going to talk about after this doesn't matter, right? It's a garbage in, garbage out scenario. So you can't use the data that you don't have, right? I highly recommend that once you've thought through the philosophical process of why you're collecting data, as I mentioned earlier, that you actually start collecting that data from day one. There is nothing worse than trying to backfill a data set and realizing that you don't have it and that you've lost a really meaningful point of start to understand the trajectory of a particular set of data. As I mentioned, there's a garbage in, garbage out analysis. Part of this is about the tools that you're utilizing to make sure that you're collecting the right data and doing it on an always-on basis, but also you have to understand what data is most meaningful to you. If you're getting the wrong data, you're going to get the wrong results, and you're going to make wrong predictions. The most important thing that I'm going to talk about is working back from the question. I mentioned this a little bit earlier. If I walk into the room as the president and CEO of a company and I say, hey, how many of X? That data better be able to answer that question or we got it wrong. So I'll show you the structure and the modality of how you start doing that to get it right. Two other really important points. It's got to be organization-wide ownership and access. You shouldn't play, oh, this data is part of my little kingdom, I'm not going to share it with you. It has to be owned by everybody. It is not just the purview of marketing, it is not just the purview of technology. There has to be a cross-platform ownership of all of this, and you have to have access to that data so that marketing can be informed, and business development can be informed, and tech can be informed, and you're all working on the same data in the same way, space, and time. Finally, philosophical point, don't just say data-driven, be data-driven. Every company says they're data-driven. My favorite question to ask is, what does that mean? Prove it. And to actually have somebody walk me through their data model, and I can tell you 9 times out of 10 that people aren't actually data-driven. They have Google Analytics and they think they're data-driven, right? So continuing on the idea of setting up a data model here. So first thing you have to do is work back from that question, and you have to define the constituencies of your question asker, both inside and outside of the organization. So it's not just what does my CEO want to know, it's what does my client want to know, it's what does my editorial team, if you're a media company, want to know, and start working back from those questions. So to give you an example, and I typically do it on a 3-layer basis. How many doctors do we have in California, Oregon, and Washington with practices who gross more than $5 million in annual revenue? That's something that BD should own, that should be in your CRM, that should be pullable and easy. I have fired people for not being able to answer this exact question, right? If you haven't set up a data model that answers that, there's a really fundamental disconnect about how we should be operating our business. You probably shouldn't be there. So that's a question that at the beginning of your company you should know is important to you. You won't be able to answer every single question. You don't know what you don't know, and there's adaptability and flexibility and flow that has to go into this. But if that's part of your business is knowing these people, set that up from day one. Layer 2. How many of those matching the above criteria have we spoken to in the last 12 months, and to what touch points were they most responsive? So here, this is owned by the purview of marketing. It's Facebook Analytics, it's partially, we've all seen the landscape of how many marketing tech tools are out there. That's another question that we have to be able to answer. And now you're starting to see how those have a knock-on effect and how there has to be mutual ownership and understanding of data on a cross-organizational basis. And the final point here is, what was the primary drop-off point in our on-site conversion and in our A and B and multivariate testing? Where do we see the greatest improvement of conversion rate optimization, right? That's something that tech should own, and you might be able to find it through your Google Analytics. If you're not able to answer all of these things, then the management layer, myself, is completely uninformed. And that's, if you're going to go into the management side and you're not in the grind in one of these particular areas, this is your obligation to make sure that you have an understanding of all of these questions, to walk around and ask and ensure that the data is working for you, because your job is to run this on an organization-wide basis. And if you're not asking these questions and pushing your staff to do that, it's your failure, not necessarily theirs. So once these answers have been provided, you have to ensure, again, that they're actionable by the recipient and not just a flat data file. I'm not going to make you lean in, take a look at this. These slides will all be sent around. In the early days of Karma, this is how we started setting up our data model, right? So even before the company was started in earnest, even before we had created piece of content one, before our website was up, before we engaged a data scientist to code all of this out for us, we started asking the questions. And I'll just walk you through this very, very briefly. This is for our editorial team. These are the types of data collection points that we needed. First, we had to understand what were the subtype 1 and 2. Who were the owners of this data, right? So we had user-side data, which would be our subscribers and site visitors that were kicking off data. And we had our internal side ownership, right? This is the Karma editorial team. We designated the actual owners of that data. Then what we started to do was ask ourselves, from a wireframe perspective, how are we going to visualize the answers to some of these questions and define this first and foremost, and this is like the one point, if you take away anything from this, is what is the business goals and objectives of that data? Not only working back from a question, but working back from how is this data ultimately going to work from us? If I would say, what's my Q score for this particular correspondent, editorial needs to know that, and I, as the management, need to know why that's very important to creating a successful business, and then I need to start to create benchmarks and tracking metrics around that. What defines good in that particular scenario? Then we move over to actions and automations. How do we do data visualization, APIs, correlation, workflow automations, all sorts of cool, wacky stuff that we can do there. Then you move on to the actual point of, well, how do we collect this stuff, right? What are the tools that we actually use? What are the goals? What are the timelines with the external databases? And by the way, there's so much data that you can collect, you can get lost in sort of data soup. So I suggest defining it by your top 5 metrics. Really anything outside of that, all you're going to do all day is spending time sifting through the data. So I would say in our particular scenario, what do we care about the most that flowed back to our business? I need to know on a monthly, quarterly, and annual basis how many pieces of content are live. What was the total runtime on average of those pieces of content? Then layering against that, what was the total watch-through rate of those particular pieces of content? Those are hugely important things that let me know as a manager that my editorial team is successful, right? Because my business might be successful, but where am I seeing inefficiencies as well, right? So this is a very important internal metric for us. Not only understand how we create further content that better services our audience, but also my editorial team who might have softer goals from a KPI and OKR perspective that I can define success for them. Last few things we did was then, how do we create synthesis around this, right? What does this mean? Now we've got the data. Who's synthesizing that and putting that to us and saying, here's to an extent what this data means. Here we're putting it all together because we're collecting innumerable data points. Who's going to present that? And then we talk about both external and internal use cases. What reports are being generated? Who's taking ownership of that? Who's taking ownership of corrections if we're seeing some of the data that's a little bit concerning to us? We're underproducing here. And then finally, we figured out who are the actual data owners on a very specific basis. So this is the way that we started asking questions and creating a framework around data. This is just the way we did it. There's a million ways to approach this. This is not, papal infallibility here. But this is how we approach data. We then hired a data scientist, a dear friend of mine, who created basically a functional data model for us, because I'm too stupid to understand these things. So at this point, what you're going to see is where we were in this particular process. We had gone through defining the business objectives that I just mentioned to you. We had talked about how we map that data across our business model to make sure it's working for us. And what you're going to see next is when we were at this phase, which was basically designing of data architecture. This is how Warren, who worked with us on this, conceptualized everything, right? From a pre-launch, launch, and scalability perspective, how we create the initial, intermediate, and then ultimately target architecture. And I'm not going to make you lean in and go through this in granular detail. These are the core components of what we would call the modern data architecture, but we also knew we couldn't afford all of those particular components. He was just kind of letting us know what was up. This is what we ultimately decided to do that was most meaningful for us, right? We wanted to keep it extremely lean. We had to create a database. That database was then going to collect information from these various sources, including our business intelligence tool that was going to do visualization. Heard that you were all working in Tableau. I have great sympathy for you. We then have a variety of apps and other intake points, and then other ways that we can do visualization outside of Tableau. Our intermediate data architecture pulls back a little bit further from that really lean model and starts looking at things like a data lake, the various sources of data points and collection, a lot of complexity that starts to get built into that, and we created synthesis by using workflow automation and technology to really help us achieve our goals. This was our target data architecture. I still don't really understand the schematic. You guys are at NYU, you're all smarter than me. Feel free to look through this in your own time and leisure. So at the end of the day, this goes back to the point that I just made, which was how do we develop these key metrics? What are those 3 to 5 key metrics for the following use cases? And these are the ones that you're starting to pattern out. What we ultimately did was take this data architecture from our data scientist, and this is another important point. How do you use a data scientist functionally? They also, I would say, shouldn't be the person that's coding out your site. A data scientist sets up this architecture and then basically puts all the points of connection into place, and then you bring in a true technologist start actually creating those APIs and start actually creating an overall synthesis. I've seen too many people that are unicorns that are quote-unquote full-stack developers and data scientists. It ultimately doesn't work out. It's just a little plug for specialization in startups, right? So what we did after we took all that together was we did engage a technologist to come in and actually provide that synthesis and create a very expensive but very robust data platform. We then use Portfolio as part of our visualization metric to create dashboards. We do use Tableau, amongst other things, to do visualization on a client-side basis. Data has worked well for us. We'll go in a little bit more specific detail on one specific scenario in a moment. As part of setting up a data model, there are a couple of key points that you have to think about. You've got to think about what I call collection point management and psychology. Has anybody here ever read Influence by Robert Cialdini? Yeah? If you haven't, it is, I think, your books aside, probably the best book on decision, choice theory, and behavioral theory that I've ever seen. It's very accessible, it's short, it is well worth it. He's written a couple of other good ones as well. He talks about a lot of the things that go through here, but specifically this idea of the rule of reciprocity. I'll give you the example that he gives and then tell you how you can apply this in a more real-world scenario. Anyone here familiar with the Hare Krishnas? Bald guys in the airport, they ask you for money? They're a religious organization. They were very prevalent in the 70s and 80s. In the 70s, they would just come up to you and ask you for money, support our cause, but no one knew who they were. They were kind of creepy looking. They were not able to meet their fundraising goals. Here's what they did. They started giving you a flower. That was the only difference. They raised $40 million in 1 year just doing that. Flower has no intrinsic value, but you felt obliged. So what I'm going to suggest to you when you're thinking of collection point management is what kind of reciprocity can you create for the person that's going to give you a point of data, even something as simple as an email. And your answer might be that if they give me their email, I'm going to provide them a service like Google does, right? But think of how if you need deeper layers of data collection, I want to know about your investable assets. It's an extremely personal thing to ask somebody. I want to get your brain waves and put them into this crazy machine. You don't know what I'm going to do with them. What kind of rules of reciprocity can you set up that people feel that they're deriving value by giving up their data? And I'm always going to urge you, as a data collector, to be highly ethical and to compensate anybody that's providing you data. I'm kind of an extremist in that sense, and I think Google should be paying everybody for everything that we do on Google, but that's a weird opinion. Focus also on incremental and step-up approach, right? So, hey, sign up for my email newsletter before putting them deeper into the data funnel. I'm a big fan of micro commitments as a way to collect additional data. There is the idea of the innocuousness of certain kinds of data collection where you don't even realize. I mean, everybody here probably has an Apple Watch. Everybody here has worn a Fitbit at some point. That kind of innocuousness where you don't even remember that you're doing data collection anymore is a nice way to collect more biometrically oriented data. There are UX tricks at the end of the day that help also with data collection management. How many times have you been on a form that's like this long, you gotta scroll down, you're seeing all these things that are required of you, your name, your address, your blood type, all these weird things, and you're just like, you know what, I'm gonna drop off. Like, I don't have this time right now. Every study shows if you do one point at one time, one collection point on the screen, your name, that's it, done. Slide to the next screen, address, next screen, but that can increase the amount of information that people are willing to give you and the overall conversion rate to whatever your end call to action might be. So from that perspective, you also want to focus on data collection from a client side and investor perspective, right? This is one thing that I actually find is kind of funny that often people set up data models and they aren't thinking about how they can provide collection management and data information back to their two most important constituencies, people that are actually supporting that business with revenue and the people that may ultimately invest in that business. If you're running a consumer business, it's not just about collecting data from those people. It's about thinking, how is that data valuable to the people who are actually going to give me the real dollars on the other side? And finally, from a data collection standpoint, I'm just going to caution you away from acquisition of third-party data. I've seen too many people try to do lookalike audiences on Facebook. I've seen too many people try to buy large sets of data from Google. I've seen too many people engage with Cambridge Analytica. I talked to them before all that crap hit the fan. Glad we didn't engage with them. It's ultimately not worth it. You want to own that data yourself, and you want to collect it in a way that's not approximate, but exact to what you're doing. Just a recommendation. So, you set up your data model, you've done all these really cool things. Let's talk now about synthesis, interpretation, and action. So, there's a broken link analogy that I'm going to use here. Everybody set their business objectives. That's easy to do. That's a manual process. Everybody can create some kind of system to collect that data. And most people can then look at that data and provide some degree of synthesis, right? And sometimes the machine will do it for you. Your watch-through rate was this, and this is what it means, and maybe even here's a benchmark. It's at this point right here, I've drawn this kind of funky-looking line, that we start to see people fall off with the most important part of data, which is now the interpretation, including the benchmark. The iteration, once you realize that you're above or below that, people get really lazy, and this is also the point where machine learning and AI, people expect machines to be able to do this iteration for them. And I find 9 times out of 10, especially with marketing automation software, that this doesn't solve. right? So somebody comes on, you're doing your A/B testing, you're trying to figure out like, oh, this works better than that, and then we're going to go deeper into that funnel by posting this kind of website based on this kind of demographic profile, and you think the machine's going to do it for you, and you missed something. And all of a sudden, a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later, you went down a data-based rabbit hole that ultimately hurts your business. So it's at this point of interpretation and iteration that I highly recommend you get involved. Don't press a button, set it, and then step back from it. You will get it wrong. Data needs to be nurtured in our day and age. Most important points of any piece of data is now the actionability. What are you going to do with it, right? There's not a system, a machine that I can see out there that does predictive modeling against this, that tells you this data said this, therefore you should do that, right? Often gets kind of close, kind of tells you, hey, here's every cancer study that's ever happened in the history of humankind. This person probably has this kind of cancer. Here's the best diagnostic methodologies against that, and it's an augmentation tool for a physician, as an example. But the action point is where most people fall off, and they're just like, oh, cool, like, I'm really glad that I've got this data. Like, I have 10,000 people show up to my site. What does that mean? Map it back to your business goals and your objectives and make sure that you're taking some kind of action to increase or decrease any kind of action the data is telling you, and then you've got to repeat this entire process. Data is not something that you set up once, walk away, and think that it's going to work out. It is highly, highly iterative, especially if you want to do trend analysis. Start to figure out, wow, that line is doing this kind of thing, right? You run a regression analysis against that. Okay, cool. There's my truth. Now I'm going to take action against that. These are just some of the fun little data screenshots that you can see. So now specifically, how does my company, the Karma Network, utilize data? So fundamentally, we have to ask ourselves, who is our audience? How do we reach them? What type of content do they want? I'm giving you a very specific example related to our editorial team, right? So we asked these fundamental questions of ourselves. This was day one. And by the way, we had very little information on this. We just had to get out and do. Then we asked incremental questions. Once we got beyond the fundamental questions and started to get answers on that, right? So we created the website, we started creating the content, and within a very short period of time, a lot of our assumptions were validated, some were obliterated, right? I talked about that a little bit earlier. So we started to understand who our audience was, what those demographic maps looked like. We started to understand what was most effective and how we were reaching them. We then started to understand this cohort likes this kind of content, that cohort likes that kind of content. How can we programmatically ensure that that person's now seeing more of that content? By the way, we're still getting it wrong, but we're doing our best, right? And we're doing better than most. Once we answered those questions, and we're still nurturing, still learning from that constantly, we now started to have to ask the incremental questions. And this is where businesses live or die. There are so many businesses that get the fundamental part right, especially in the media space, where they find a product market fit with audience and content, but they fail to differentiate on those corner cases at the margin. That's where you live and die. So now we have to start to ask, like, how do we create a more effective user segmentation, right? Like, that person likes healthcare stories. Is that enough? No, that person's actually really interested in investable opportunities and fertility in Hong Kong. Are there more people like that? Should we be creating more content and go deeper into that? How do we start getting those answers? How do we maximize our conversion rate optimization? We're a subscription-based business, right? So we have to understand, like, what are we doing right and wrong against that audience to now really ensure that we're going from a 10% conversion of all unique visitors to a 15%. How do we do that? And then how can I make content creation more cost efficient? Don't forget about our friends in finance, right? Like, these are the guys that actually are really living and dying off of data, because that's how you have a business, right? And at the end of the day, these are the folks that should be fed with just as much data as any other general manager within your organization to understand all these things. How do we increase revenue? How do we decrease costs? These are some of the fundamental questions that we're asking ourselves. It's really, really easy to get really, really lazy when it comes to data, now telling us that we're doing a really good job, and not going back and fundamentally analyzing, could we be more cost effective with the creation of our content? Could we actually widen that margin by 3% all throughout our funnel? And if we can, what does that mean for our bottom line? And then we also focused at one point on the client and investor data delivery. That was usually important for us. We have a lot of very large brand sponsor clients. They're not going to, JP Morgan's not going to let me get away with, like, hey, here's a screenshot of our Google Analytics, right? We have to create customized data reports for them, which created a whole different system that we had to create internally. They had very custom specific requests. We're outside the normal data collection parameters. And by the way, our investors were asking very similar things. We're a weird business in some ways, so we had to create custom data collection methodologies to service their needs. So don't forget about those folks. So let's very quickly talk about a specific scenario, a virtuous cycle here. So editorial started creating content, right? That's our starting point. Our OTT player, which is an over-the-top player, something called Zeit, started to collect data against them. Watch-through rates, who was watching, when were they watching, et cetera, et cetera. It also told us what our watch-through rate was, which is one of the metrics by which we determine success or not success with our content. And by the way, it's also how we comped out a lot of our journalists. The journalists, we ask you to create X number of pieces of content, but that doesn't determine quality of that content other than anecdotally. This was a metrically accountable way to say, if somebody's watching your story and you feel that that was a good story that you put out there, you should have a watch rate higher than X. I mean, in our case, it was higher than 75% for a video that was less than 3 minutes, right? If you had less than that, your content was crappy, right? So that started to tell us that. That's back to that goal that I just mentioned, which was a 75% watch-through rate on videos of less than 3 minutes. That then fed into marketing, who mapped it against our demographic data to start getting more and more refined and more particular to increase that watch-through rate metric by understanding our cohort even better. And guess what we did? We started doing that cycle all over again, right? So it just got smaller and smaller, and so we got more and more effective until, see, we ran that campaign for 3 months, and our 75% watch-through rate went through 90%. And that's one very specific example of how data can create a really important virtuous cycle.
And that's a question about the watch-through rate. So all the content here is video-based. So okay, so there's no like just text-based article.
There is always text-based articles on the bottom, but you have to engage with the video. So once you've clicked on that video, and what we've done, and it's a very important point, is to ensure that the actual text below is not a direct transcript of the video. People are lazy. It's also something that Cialdini talks about in Influence, right? He calls it the click-word scenario. Like, why is Amazon successful, right? It shouldn't be by all measures because it's Walmart. But they made it just a little bit easier. We're biologically wired, just like lions in the sun, to be lazy. Like, why doesn't a lion eat every antelope that walks by? It certainly could, because it's biologically programmed with algorithms that say this isn't worth the output of energy to get the input of energy that's required. Human beings are the same way. Just more of our input-output metrics are in our head, right? So when we were looking at this, it's a very good question. We said, how can we create text-based content that won't cannibalize video watching overall, because that's an important metric for us, and ensure that if you're watching the video, you have to watch it more, because that text will not give you all the answers that you need, right? So, client question that was related to how Karma uses data. How do we ensure that I'll create content with the highest engagement for users that are interested in healthcare investments? It wasn't these folks, but let's imagine that was JP Morgan asking that question, right? A real interest in healthcare technology, their clients are asking about it. This is a question that an actual client asked us, because we're creating content on their behalf. We do what we call co-created content for our branded content partners. There were multiple cohorts, going back to my earlier point, about this is a cross-organizational ownership. Editorial had to own this, business management and finance, marketing, biz dev, design, technology, and product. So here's how we started to do that and map that out. Editorial, we said, has to start by creating 1,000 pieces of content. Even before the JP Morgan thing, they have to have created 1,000 pieces so that we can start collecting data against that to be able to answer that question in the first place. Otherwise, like, JP Morgan's going to come in and ask that question and be like, I don't know, what do you know, right? Or we're going to have to lie. So we already had 1,000 valid data points with a lot of that content having been created in the healthcare space in order to start answering those questions. From a marketing perspective, we then had to figure out, based on the distribution and tracking of that, what kind of content was working, what kind of demographics were we seeing, right? And this goes all back to sort of like ethically treating data and being able to look a client in the face and tell them real truths. From a business management perspective, we had to look at an optimization curve of that content and our actual ROI. Again, don't forget our friends in finance here. So as we were looking at actually modeling out this branded content partnership, we needed to have the data that told us, for example, on a per minute basis, how much does our content actually cost us? Because it's not just the aggregate amount of content, it's the entire production value. Each minute has its own cost. Most of it's tied up in the first minute, drops off a little bit after that. But JP Morgan can't come in and say, hey, I want you to create like a dozen 80-minute videos for us. The cost there is excessively high. From a business development perspective, we had to ensure that we were leveraging data to be able to create a custom plan for them based on the knowledge that we had. Design had to be able to visualize that data in a material way so that we could service that back to the client, but also in a way that was understandable by us as the actual creators of that content. And then finally, technology and product had to be able to create an algorithmic feedback loop that could service that content to the right audience. All these things on a cross-organizational basis had to be in place both before, during, and after, in order to answer that one question. I'll replicate that dozens of times over, and you try to get a sense of how difficult data can be to get right. By all means.
Since the content is video-based, do you actually do like video analytics? For example, you take a look at the text and the audio and the video features, and then you kind of find out which type of content might engage your audience. So, for example, maybe for the audio features, maybe the specific way that the presenter is in the video can actually change the engagement of the
100%. I'll actually talk about some of the emotional response data that we get that's really important, but we test everything from the length and number of characters of our headlines to get somebody to actually engage in that video, the per second basis of how long that video is to increase watch through rate and also the clickability of that. There is an innumerable amount of data that we get in from understanding video-based content. We still struggle with some of the things where AI is starting to creep in a little bit of like, if a presenter is wearing a red shirt versus a blue shirt, does that increase desire to watch through a little bit more, or does that increase engagement with social media? Now, we don't understand the reasons why, and AI is just starting to figure out that that's a blue shirt or a red shirt, but that's really interesting to us because, again, you live on the corners, right? Everybody can create good data, but subconsciously we don't know why we're engaged, or good content, we don't know why we're engaging with that. There are psychologically based reasons for that. So let me tell you about how we answer this specific question, just again across these six different constituencies that we own. So we had to make sure that our data told a story, and that story then created an algorithm, right? So our data had to say, these types of people like this type of content at this time of day, in this way, with this headline of this length, maybe with a presenter that has this kind of a smile. That was all then fed into an algorithm wherever we could, so we could automate as much of that process away and service that content most effectively to the most effective cohort. So with 1,000 pieces of content that we had created initially to get our pre-marketing down, around 100 of those had healthcare-related meta tags, right? But still very undifferentiated. Our client was really most interested in the idea of users with investable assets above X number of dollars and younger than 45. We knew part of that equation. So we segmented out viewers that had that. It's really tough to get people to talk about their money. We took a couple of guesses there, and that's a really important point. When you don't know, don't not act, guess. And you will know very quickly if you got it right or wrong. We then did basically what I would call a 5-vector analysis. So we did a deeper demographic dive, right, talking about where did they gain their first awareness, where were they located. So we started to get deeper into those demographics to more finely tune that algorithm. We did a headline length analysis, as I mentioned to you. We then started figuring out within those healthcare topics, what subcategories were our audience most interested in, because JP Morgan didn't know. They're like, we want to talk about healthcare, but we don't know what to talk about in healthcare. We're failing at this. Tell us. We then talked about length of content. We paired that with a watch-through ratio, right? So we right-sized that over time. And then here's a really cool thing. Take a look at if you guys are off computers. So look at something called Dumbstruck. There's a bunch of folks that do this. They are basically a neurologically linked eye motion tracker that tells you while you're watching a piece of video-based content, what you're experiencing from an emotional basis. Are you experiencing joy, anger, fear, frustration? And it's all tied to a science of actual eye movement. Widening of the pupils, looking left, right. It also tells you about intention and attention by how much your eyes are actually on the screen. Are they moving around? So the watch-through rate only tells part of the story. You watched it. Were you cooking dinner while you were doing it? Right? What were you doing with that data? It's a really cool piece of software. Here's where it fell short. Many people would watch. We had a comedy show called Hey Gordon for a while. We got a very senior venture capitalist to jump into a hot tub with us. We did a very funny story with that. We had one of our guys walk out in a Borat-style mankini. Everybody in that moment that was watching the video felt disgust. That was one of the emotional responses. But I, now interpreting that data, didn't know what that meant, right? I know you're experiencing disgust. Does that mean that you wanted to get deeper engaged? Was that a positive emotion? Or does that mean that you were ready to tune out? And so that was the layer that was always failing for us, was to understand if you're experiencing joy, does that increase your desirability to adhere to a call to action? They said yes, but when we really pushed them on how they had done that actual analysis, it kind of started to fall apart. You can make assumptions that if you're happy, you're more likely to sign up for a service. They just couldn't prove that out. At the end of the day, what we were able to do with all this data was create a predictive content creation model. Again, that algorithmically tuned distribution and targeting model was able to deliver on results to that very specific question. So, we talked about how Karma uses data, but let's talk very briefly about how Karma Network does not use data. We don't do everything. I love showing LUMAscapes. There's too much to do. You can spend a year setting up your data model and your collection points, and you will still not actually have any data. So figure out how to lean out your model and do what's within the length of your financial cable toe, such as it is. Again, we don't collect data for the sake of collecting data. This is what I call the passive dataist. Like, it's okay to be a data nerd, right? Like, I'm not going to harm you for that, but you've really got to have intentionality. And so we have cut a lot of points of data collection that we know are not important to us and are just going to cloud out a very clear story. We don't take one point of information and then assume that that's truth forever. Talk about sort of nurturing your data set and monitoring it through time, nor do we assume that that's a trend. I know that sounds really basic to be like, there's a data point on a graph. And you say, of course, like there has to be 2, probably even 3 points of data that start to form a slope, positive or negative, start to understand it. I can't tell you how many times, early stage, someone comes in, I'm an investor, and they're pitching me, and they're telling me about this data point. I'm like, cool, how's it been doing for the last 12 months? What's the trend on that? I don't know, this is where we're at today. I'm like, that's great. Is that 80% worse than you were last month? Like, where are you going with this, right? Where are you going to be next month? Like, where's everything going? So one data point, a trend does not make. We don't only make data-informed decisions. I've harped on this a little bit. The gut still counts at the end of the day, right? So if you don't know, guess. It's worth the effort. We reconcile that all owners have to adopt the same data truths. I can't tell you how many times organizations are working at cross-data purposes and interpreting data in very, very different ways, and that ultimately leads to a lot of unproductive debates. So assume that there are certain data truths that you can all adhere to, that this walkthrough rate is good, right? We all agree on that, and now all constituent components of the organization now say that's our target, right? And marketing doesn't set some much higher bar, and BD sets a much lower bar for whatever their own selfish reasons are. We don't let contradictory data give us analysis paralysis. You will come across data from 2 different sources that will say 2 very different things, and it may be impossible to reconcile them. Pick which one you think is most relevant and put more emphasis on that. It will help you move past it, and if you're wrong, you'll be able to adapt and iterate really quickly. Do not be afraid to fail. Last couple of slides. So here's a very special case. When there's no data, how many of you here, when you graduate, want to start a startup at some point in your life, or go work for a startup? Not a single person in here? Everyone wants to go be a doctor, a lawyer, or an accountant? Fine, this is a very relevant slide. Let's assume that at some point you're going to go work for a startup company, or by the way, even a large organization. Most people fake data until they make it. There will be many, many scenarios where you would be living with data ambiguity, where you will not have data at all. You will not have collected data, you won't know what the data says, and somebody competitively will be able to outsize you with data always. Let me give you a very specific example. Anybody here know a company called Lemonade, an insurance company, founded by the guy that founded Fiverr? They're a really interesting company that has entered the renter's insurance market. Super ripe for disruption, right? Because renter's insurance is basically a controlled rate. You can't do anything differentiated on fees. The way that they've actually made it work is they have a very algorithmic customer service model, so they've leaned out costs. It's a really interesting post that I suggest you look at by the CEO founder that talks about why they've lost money for the last 2 years. They get something called their loss ratio incorrect. And he points out something very specific. They didn't know. They didn't have access to Geico or USAA or any of the major insurance companies. That's all proprietary on what a good loss ratio looked like, and they got it wrong. They were paying out more in actual claims than they were getting back in premiums. But Geico and all those other guys, they're making profit off of that because they have literally 90 years of data. Now they, in 2 years, are going to be able to get that right. They've just hit their point of profitability. So what they did is they didn't say, hey, we got to go out and test this, and maybe buy data from somebody or partner up with Geico. They said, let's do it. Let's get out there. Let's get started with this. And we're going to have a little bit of investment capital raised, and we're going to waste some of our own time for 2 years to figure out what is wrong. And then we're going to be able to be competitively advantaged because we believe we can do this right with our algorithm, with our AI, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in that scenario, in the absence of data, a smart entrepreneur will not back away. They will full throttle into the breach, and the data will start appearing because you're existing. And if you set up the data model, like I told you, you'll be able to collect that, and if you're a relatively smart human being, you'll be able to interpret that to your distinct advantage. So, here are my 3 bold predictions. Again, I assure you most of them are wrong. So, bold prediction number 1. Big data is not getting it right. If you haven't, I highly, highly suggest you read this article in the Wall Street Journal about Palantir, which is backed by Peter Thiel and many other folks. It has lost money. One of its biggest clients for a while was the Hershey Chocolate Company. Here's why. All they were doing was collecting the data in a way that other people hadn't before. First of all, the data was irrelevant, and there was nobody that was able to interpret that data or to integrate it in an actionable way that Hershey's like, I'm able to sell 10,000 more bars of chocolate that justifies the $5 million that I just paid you. So big data, when all you're doing is providing a large data set and a really cool looking graph, actually means very, very little. And Palantir is a word of caution against that. Bold prediction number 2. Internet of Things will create more noise than it ultimately will signal. We are at a very interesting point in our existence where we've figured out pretty well how to collect data, sometimes with people not knowing about it, and we are now in a data glut, especially with IoT, right? You just use a simple example of putting IoT sensors out on the highway. We now know everything about cars going back and forth and what they're doing, traffic patterns, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there will come a point where that data will be highly relevant, where we will be able to synthesize that data and make meaningful action against that. But I'm going to predict to you right now that those are going to be incremental changes, not from an investor's perspective, the major overnight, wow, we've got a bunch of data points through IoT sensors. Man, we really know how to make this business a success. So you're going to start to see little quantifiable improvements over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Blockchain is in a similar factor where there's tons of data coming in. We don't quite know what to do with it yet. So in 50 years, and we're all much older, and I'm still very handsome, we're going to come back and see how IoT played out, and I guarantee you then we might be able to provide, from an AI algorithmic basis, actionability as related to that. Bold and final prediction number 3. AI is not the answer. I'm that guy. So it hasn't done it yet. It might be in the future. And again, AI is really just machine learning. And why isn't AI getting it just yet? Your professor gave an interesting example. It's still figuring out when a carrot's a carrot, when a hot dog's a hot dog, right? Especially when it comes to video. It's getting better at pictures. Like, there's so much data in a single piece of video that AI has no idea how to figure out. So you're telling me that AI is going to replace something that my 5-year-old daughter knows how to do, which is like, that's a bunny rabbit, daddy, and AI is like, monster? Like, they're not quite there yet, right? So we're still probably 50 to 100 years out from having true what's called general artificial intelligence that can replace a human being and make a lot of the data on an iterative basis extremely actionable. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, by the way, right? We have to go into that modality, but it does mean that I don't think any of you should be banking on AI.
Have you heard of Google Duplex?
I have heard.
So can I just hear what you have to say about it then in regards to AI? Because I think that disagrees with what you just said about AI not being like a bunny rabbit versus like being able to do a machine being able to do like a phone call with like all the data that you've given it and return it back to like consumers.
It's getting better, right? So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying like we're not somewhere. Right? The analogy that is always used is we're like toddler phase on the AI continuum, not there yet. And I'm unimpressed with it so far, right? Partially as an investor, when I put my investor hat on, Google's a little different. They have their skunk works and they're doing cool, weird things. It's not always accessible by all folks. It's not open source. But at the end of the day, someone that comes in and says, hey, we're an AI-enabled company. You peel back the layers. It's really not there for most companies out there. Google is most likely to lead the way. I'm still very skeptical that we're going to get anywhere that's highly actionable, mostly because machine learning is really what it is. It's identification, that it puts it into a machine learning loop that says, thank you for giving me this information. I'm now going to iterate in this circle based on processes that you played out for me. What it's not doing yet is saying, here's this circle. I'm going to intuit, like a human being can, and extrapolate information that hasn't been given to me to create a new iterative cycle that actually improves on that process. So while
that's what I think like Duplex exactly did though. So like I don't know if you saw like the version where like someone had like an accent when they called and like it was able to still figure out like the reservations and stuff. So I guess like I agree that like for smaller companies like yeah these things apply, but like for like bigger companies like Google or Facebook like the most competitive tech companies, I don't think this is applicable.
Well, I'll argue back that I think it is in one way. So, and I don't know a ton about Duplex, but I will tell you in that specific example of accent identification, it was filling in some gaps based on information that had been given to it by listening to thousands of people talk in a variety of accents and start to iterate back against that data. You still have to do the data input, right? It's figuring out small data gaps. It's not intuiting in the way that I'm saying leading towards actionability from a marketing perspective, right?
Okay.
So it's still doing identification based on sort of a virtuous data cycle. You give me all these inputs, thank you. Yeah, maybe missing. It's doing what we talked about earlier, which is this idea of guessing. There's X, there's Z, I can't quite figure out why. You give me enough information that I can probably take a meaningful guess, and I'm more right than I'm not. I might still get it wrong like a human being. It's still not at the level of a human being in terms of interpretation, which is why whenever you've ever done a transcribing service, they still always have human beings on the back end that then go back through and correct the automated use of the transcribing service. It's getting better, don't get me wrong, right? And I'm very hopeful. I've worked at an AI company, ostensibly. So I see a great amount of future. But the ability to identify an accent, the ability to identify the difference between a hot dog and a carrot, that's step one. That's stuff that all of us in this room can do. When you need to do something, say, at scale, from an artificial intelligence perspective, and have that AI take action on your behalf, there are a few companies that claim they can do it. I've diligenced them. I'm trying to think of the one that I thought did it the best. Think of it after the class, I'm sure. There are a few companies that can start to make predictive moves that do ostensibly improve your marketing. I've been mostly unimpressed with those that say they can, and by the way, here's the great secret of the AI industry. Many of them actually have human beings on the back end that are making a lot of those fixes still, and they still claim it's AI. Like X.AI, everybody's favorite scheduling assistant, Amy, small amount of machine learning. There's a whole group of folks in India and Bangladesh that are still doing all of the actual AI-based input, and they're claiming it's AI. It's fine, it's a little unethical, but that's just true. So I do believe that this will be the modality of the future. I will caution you of going into marketing careers because you will be automated away, but you could probably get a nice retirement package before the next 30 or 40 years. But this is the future, but it's not the future right now. And that's it. So now I would love to take your questions. Please be challenging.
Right, yeah. Since we're talking about big data, what's your opinion on Cambridge Analytica?
Yeah. So literally met with those guys, some of the ones that got arrested, or at least not indicted, but wagged a finger at, like 2 weeks before all of that broke. I'm a little weird in the sense that I think that everybody should be paying for data, but I don't think that if we're not doing anything illegal, that we should really genuinely worry about our practice. That's just the philosophy from which I approach this. I think Cambridge Analytica, and we may not like what they utilized it for, which was getting Trump elected, while they were unethical, right, at the end of the day, it didn't bother me as fundamentally as it did several other people. Big data is our future. Everything that we do is going to be tracked. It is going to be utilized by political corporations, by regular corporations, by everything out there to try to make the world ostensibly better. There will always be bad actors. Here's what so we'll leave the classroom, I hope. I admire Cambridge Analytica in the sense that they were able to pull this off. And what they were able to do with the data was get somebody elected. I don't like who they elected, right? But politics aside, they actually did big data right. They did it in highly unethical ways, which shows when you have that data set and the right kind of people and the right kind of proprietary algorithm, you may actually be able to influence not only marginal outcomes, but fundamental outcomes as well. So Cambridge Analytica this is a very bad analogy, but I'm Jewish so I can say it, it's a little like Mengele with the Nazis doing experiments on twins that allow us to figure out like, wow, this is the genetic reason for this disease and we can now cure it. Many, many bioethical questions well beyond my capacity to understand whether we should use and integrate that into our modern medicine. Cambridge Analytica the same. They kind of proved with their unethical behavior that things could be done, and now it's our question of whether we're going to use some of their techniques and some of the learnings that we got from that bad experience on a go-forward basis. Hopefully I was answering your question.
Yeah, you did answer my question. I was just wondering if, so, based on your answer, you do believe whatever we did was like completely feasible and it actually happened for whoever is doubting whether, their actions were successful.
I mean, I think they were able to create content. They were able to target audiences that in a way that nobody has ever been able to do before because they live in the world of ethics. So they were able to do something that I don't think even Amazon or Google has been able to see in the past, and that was truly fundamentally influence behavior in a completely new way. So I'm impressed in that way, but again, I will caution you to live within the boundaries of ethics whenever you can. Yes.
You keep saying that companies should be paying for data. So
Yeah.
are you suggesting that they pay individuals for the data that they give up?
Yes, please.
And how much would you pay an individual for the data?
I am not smart enough to answer the second part of your question, right? And kind of create sort of like a pricing, model around what your data is worth. Crazy idea for a startup. I'm not going to do it. So if you want to, go ahead, create a marketplace for the exchange of data where you actually opt out of, say, using Google, right? And now you say, Google, I will not utilize you. Now this has to be done en masse, of course, until you start paying me for every point of data that you have that feeds back into the system that ultimately uses my data to enrich and profit you. It's not going to happen. Let me be very clear, right? Like, we are going to be still very willing, I think, as a society to give up our data and certain elements of our privacy for convenience. Google provides a service. It does. I never signed a user agreement with Google the day that I logged on. None of you have, right? So there's an interesting ethical question around that. There's an interesting question when you walk in and allow your brainwaves to be read or allow your DNA to come back to you, whether or not you should be compensated for any extra uses, knock-on uses of that DNA that, yeah, I got my ancestry and now I get to know who my great-great-grandmother was and where she came from. Cool. But now you're also using that DNA on an anonymized basis to start to do other things that maybe I haven't explicitly agreed to. Can we find a way to create a market for that? Many people have actually tried. No one has actually been successful, and this goes back to that idea of sort of our basic laziness. Convenience trumps ethics almost every single time. It's a bit of a cynical statement, but I think you'll actually find that it's quite true. Cambridge Analytica is perhaps an example of that.
So you don't think the service is enough as like a payment? Because no one's really forcing you to use Google. You can use other search engines. So like individuals choose to use that because they're providing the superior service in comparison to the competition.
I think that's a perfectly valid argument, right? And that's always the pushback that you get against that. Yes, they're providing you with a service for which you don't have to put any money in. I will make the argument that my data is then being used to service back ads to me on a programmatic basis that, if they're getting it done right, is going to force me to spend more money on the margin. So it has an indirect cost that I may not actually understand and experience in that modality of Google, because I may not even remember that the first time I saw an ad for that kitchen apron that I bought was on Google that used my data against me, and now I just paid $50 for something I didn't really need. So I'll make that argument, which is to say that as long as Google's using that data to make money, especially off of me, I'm entitled to it.
Does your company have an ethical code?
We do. We have an ethical code, not so much around data, where we do adhere to, we have privacy agreement, we adhere to GDPR, et cetera, we adhere to the Can't Spam Act. There's not as much of an ethical conversation as I would like around how we're going to use that data, but I'm okay with it because we're not using the data. We don't sell the data. We don't do anything with it other than for our own internal purposes to serve you with better content. We do have a very strong ethical code for everything else, especially like creating a Chinese wall between editorial and business development to keep our editorial very pure, to ensure we're doing the right stories without undue influence. We spend weeks really writing this out and looking at every corner case of ethics that has existed. So it's important, not just with data, but I would say as a general statement in all aspects of things that you do to create a fundamental code of ethics, because I can tell you, it doesn't matter until it does, right? When you're caught doing something unethical and you don't have a code of ethics and a corrected course of action and repercussions around that, now you look like a true bad actor. Anything else from folks?
All right. So thank you so much, Neil, for the insightful lecture. We'll actually generate a small gift for you from our class.
Thank you. And I'll offer a last point. I think all of my contact information is on the slides when they're sent around. I do very much welcome you to reach out to me via email and let me know if it would be helpful and further share my contribution with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's give Neil our last big round of applause for her.